Hello class, and this is the next lecture on the main focus of macroeconomics. And there's three basic or main areas of focus that we concentrate on. One of the areas of focus is the problem of unemployment. And well, basically we can kind of think of these as either problems or goals. So we can think of it as the problem of unemployment, or we can think of it as the goal of full employment. Or we can think of it as the problem of inflation or deflation. Inflation is when the price level is increasing, and deflation is hence when the price level is decreasing. So we can think of that as a problem, or we can think of that as a goal of price stability. And then we can think of the problem of recession or depression, or again, if we want to be more optimistic, we can think of it as a goal of economic growth. So all macroeconomists and all policy makers basically concentrate on these three problems: unemployment, or the goal of full employment, inflation or deflation, or the goal of price stability, and recession, depression, or the goal of economic growth. So the first one we're going to concentrate on is unemployment. And it's interesting, in the U.S. we calculate the official unemployment rate in a very specific manner. And we don't actually count everybody who is unemployed. What we do is we take a survey, and the survey is done by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and they conduct it monthly, and they interview 55,800 households, and that is it. And they just interview them over the telephone. So when they make that call, the first question the surveyor asks is the respondent presently working? If the respondent answers yes, that they're presently working, they are counted as in the labor force and employed. Now, if they say no, they're not working, then the surveyor asks the second question, and that is, have they been actively seeking work in the past 4 weeks? Now, this is a very important point here, actively seeking work in the last 4 weeks, because to be counted as unemployed, at least in the United States, you have to be not working and actively looking for a position in the past month. And there's a very specific definition, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, what actively seeking work means. It means scheduling a job interview, applying for a job, contacting an employment agency, answering want ads, or anything that is equivalent to actively looking for a position in the past 4 weeks. So, if the answer is no, they currently don't have a job, and yes, they've been actively looking for a job in the past 4 weeks, that respondent is counted as officially unemployed, and they're counted as being in the labor force. So the labor force then includes all the workers who are employed and all the workers who are officially unemployed, i.e. those workers who are actively looking for work. Okay, that's the labor force. So this, because we define the labor force in that way in the United States, then there must be workers who are out of the labor force. So workers who are not presently employed and have not been actively looking for work in the past 4 weeks, even if they were looking actively before that, if they have not been looking for work in the past 4 weeks, they're not counted as officially unemployed, and they're not counted as being in the labor force. So, among this category of workers who are not counted as officially unemployed are called discouraged workers. And this category fluctuates between 500,000 and 1.5 million people per year. And basically, discouraged workers are workers who were looking for work in the past, but then because they couldn't find work, they just gave up looking. So they got discouraged. So they basically said, forget this. I can't find a job, and I'm just going to stop looking for work. Well, when they do that, they're not counted as unemployed. Well, they're not counted as officially unemployed by the measure of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So the official unemployment rate, then, is those who are officially unemployed divided by the labor force. And again, the labor force is only those working and those who are officially unemployed, times 100%. Now the marginalization rate is equal to those who are officially unemployed plus the discouraged workers plus the involuntary part-time workers, and then that's divided by the labor force plus discouraged workers times 100%. We call this the marginalization rate. And why? Because that includes workers who were not included before, discouraged workers and involuntary part-timers. This first group of workers were not counted in the official unemployment rate. This second group of workers were counted as employed in the official rate, so now we're counting them as unemployed. So the marginalization rate tacks on not only the official unemployed in the numerator, but you add on the discouraged workers and involuntary part-timers as unemployed, who we weren't counting before, and then we divide that by the labor force plus discouraged workers, and then multiply that by 100%, and you get the marginalization rate. So the marginalization rate, what it does is it brings in some group of workers who were not counted before, and it could be 1.5 to 2 times the official rate, the official unemployment rate. Now we have involuntary part-time workers. We just mentioned those in the marginalization rate. Involuntary part-time workers are those workers who have been working part-time but who want and need to be working full-time. Not those working part-time and who want to be working part-time. Okay, so involuntary part-timers. So who's not counted as unemployed, who are counted as unemployed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and who are not. So not counted as officially unemployed are the discouraged workers and the involuntary part-timers that we mentioned before. Also not counted are all these groups of workers here. Mothers without adequate or affordable childcare, workers who cannot physically get to places of employment, so they're unemployed because they don't have transportation. Workers who are on strike are not counted as officially unemployed. Workers who suffer from a natural disaster are not counted as officially unemployed. Workers who have a long-term illness are not counted. The homeless are not counted. And why are the homeless not counted? Well, because the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates the official unemployment rate by doing a household telephone survey. So, by default, the homeless and the phoneless are not counted as officially unemployed. And then workers who are working for a family business without pay, or any workers working without pay, they're not counted as unemployed either. Underemployment is different than unemployment. Underemployment means workers are overqualified for jobs. And economists call this disguised unemployment. So this would be like me, a PhD in economics, if I was cooking food at Applebee's, or some examples I have here, engineers delivering pizza, surgeons driving cabs, etc., etc. Now, a surgeon driving a cab, well, is he counted as unemployed? No, because he has a job. He's driving a taxi cab. But is he underemployed? Absolutely. And that's why we call this disguised unemployment. So what does this mean? This means that we have millions and millions of people that are without full-time work, and therefore without a steady income and financial security. And what this also means is that this group, when you have massive unemployment, by simply not counting people as unemployed, it means that they end up borrowing money, getting over their heads in debt, and then suffering from many social problems that are also related to unemployment, like increase in divorce rates, increase in crime, things like that. Further, what this all means is that society is not only suffering the social cost of unemployment, but they're losing all the potential production of goods and services that could potentially come if society were producing at full employment. And the economy is losing potential spending that all the unemployed workers could be engaged in. So unemployment means lower income, lower spending, lower business sales, so lower investment and lower profits, and layoffs at these businesses and sluggish growth, and this creates a vicious downturn in the economy. So, for example, when we first suffer an economic downturn and people lose their jobs, well, again, unemployment means lower income. So what do workers stop doing? The first thing workers stop doing is they stop consuming luxury goods. So what workers stop doing is, they stop purchasing $4 and $5 lattes. It's one of the first things that consumers cut when they become unemployed. So basically, what happens is that you have a bunch of people getting unemployed, so then what do they stop doing? They stop buying their $4 or $5 lattes. Then all of a sudden, Starbucks is losing business and losing profits. So what does Starbucks do? Well, they start shutting down, and then all of a sudden you have Starbucks closed down all around the country. But then now that increases unemployment in our society, and it creates this vicious downward cycle. So that's the problem of unemployment. It's not just one sector of the economy. It's when you have unemployment in one sector that bleeds into lower sales in other sectors, which then generates layoffs in those sectors, which then generates more unemployment, and then lower sales and etc., etc. A vicious downward cycle. Lower production and income and spending. Unemployment has an impact on self-esteem. People want to be working. People want to be seen doing good works. Employment is more than just a job. Employment is one's identity. So when people ask me, what do? I say that I'm a economics professor, right? My job gives myself an identity. Amartya Sen, who's a Nobel Prize winning economist, he calls this the recognition aspect. And being unemployed, you lose this part. So the social impacts of unemployment, it is virtually related to every major social problem. Like I talked about before, you have increases in crime, family disruption, suicide, ill health, increases in drug addiction, homelessness, malnutrition, poor prenatal care, school dropouts, etc. Further costs of unemployment, you have technological stagnation. Unemployment creates a deterioration of one's labor skills, destabilizing business expectations, political instability, and environmental damage. Therefore, if we have all these costs of unemployment, then there must be benefits to full employment. And that means Well, full employment means more outcome, or more output, more income, more spending, less poverty, less crime, less drugs, less racial tension, less family disruption, more financial security, increased education, better health, environmental protections, better wages, better working conditions, and the benefits to society of full employment just are they're just magnified. It's full employment affects every sector in society and the economy, even indirectly. So, like environmental protection, that's indirectly affected by full employment. So, unemployment and full employment. What we see here is that unemployment disproportionately affects certain minority groups. So here I have a graph. On this graph, this is the unemployment rate of African Americans throughout time here from, looks like 1990 to 2005. And here's the white unemployment rate. And what do we notice here? We notice that, and this is post financial crisis. Sorry, this is pre-financial crisis. Financial crisis was in 2007. So what do we see here? We see that when the unemployment rate was at its highest for whites, so that's about what? Looks about like, 6.5%, maybe 7% unemployment rate is the highest unemployment rate for the white population. That's still lower than the lowest that's still higher than the lowest unemployment rate for African Americans, which means in the very best of times, African Americans are doing still worse off than the white population at the worst of times. So, unemployment has different effects on different people and different ethnicities. So, when we talk about the benefits of full employment, and we talk about how full employment can achieve racial equity, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about this gap here. We're talking about, narrowing this entire gap, but we're talking about equalizing this a little bit. So then when there's an economic downturn, African Americans aren't affected more by an economic downturn than white Americans are. Inflation and deflation. So this is the second point that we made here. Inflation is a persistent increase in the general price level, or we say that there's an increase in the average price level, and then deflation is a persistent decrease in the general price level, or a decrease in prices. Inflation lowers the real value of money because prices go up, so therefore our dollars buy less goods. And then deflation increases the real value of money. But just because inflation is bad does not mean deflation is good. In fact, deflation is actually worse, as we will see later on in the course. So, when we talk about inflation and deflation, we need to distinguish between real and nominal values. So, one's nominal income is the face value of your income. So if you get paid $10 an hour, that $10 is what we call your nominal income or your nominal wages. Your real income is the purchasing power of that $10. So your nominal income can remain constant over time. So think if you just made $10 an hour every year for the next 10 years. Well, over time, that $10 an hour is going to buy less and less goods. So your real income it would actually go lower if the purchasing power of your nominal income falls. So to calculate your real income, we have to adjust for inflation and deflation. So let's do an example here. If inflation is 3% and your nominal income stays the same, then your real income has fallen by 3%. If you get a 2% raise and inflation is 3%, your real income falls by that difference, right? 2% minus 3%, which equals minus 1%. So your real income falls by 1%. So just because inflation is bad, we said, doesn't mean deflation is good. And we said that deflation is in fact worse than inflation. However, inflation and deflation does not affect everybody the same. Inflation can help borrowers, and it can help borrowers and hurt lenders. So, for example, right, we said inflation decreases the real purchasing power of your dollar, right? But if I borrowed $100 from the bank today and I had to pay it back in 10 years, well, if there was inflation, I'm paying back that $100, well, that $100 I'm paying back is not worth as much than what I borrowed it. So it helps me, the borrower, it hurts the lender, because I'm paying back dollars that are cheaper than when I originally borrowed it. So banks hate inflation. Alright, now we're turning to measures of the national economy, and we call this gross domestic product and gross national product. And we have to talk about real gross domestic product and nominal gross domestic product. So there's a difference before we get to real versus nominal. We have to talk about the difference between gross domestic product and gross national product. Gross national product is calculated by citizenship. Gross domestic product is calculated by residence. So, nominal gross national product and gross domestic product are in current prices or dollars. Real gross national product and gross domestic product are in constant prices or dollars. And we call this a price deflator. And a price deflator is used to calculate the real value, or we adjust for nominal GDP and GNP. So, economic growth, GDP and GNP are statistics that are used to measure economic growth. But we like to calculate this based upon the entire population, because what GDP is, it is a measure of the total spending in the domestic economy, or in the domestic United States. But we can't compare the gross domestic product, or the total spending in the United States, with the gross domestic product of total spending in, say, Brazil. Why? Because the United States is a lot bigger than Brazil, right? So we would expect that total spending in the U.S. economy, or GDP in the U.S. economy, is larger than that of Brazil. And we would expect that Brazil's GDP is a lot larger than Cuba's GDP. Why? Because, well, it has to be, because Brazil is a hell of a lot larger than Cuba, right? So we would expect that the gross domestic product in Brazil, the total spending in Brazil's economy, is larger than Cuba's. We would expect that the U.S. total spending, or U.S. GDP, is larger than Brazil's, which is larger than Cuba's. But could we say that, just because U.S. GDP is larger than Brazil, that the U.S. is better off than Brazilians are? Well, no, not really. We can't compare these aggregate numbers. So what we do is we take total spending, or total gross domestic product, and we divide that by the population in each country. And that way we get a total spending per person, or it's kind of like a proxy for individual spending or individual income. And we call this GDP per capita. And we can discuss this in real GDP per capita in constant dollars or nominal GDP per capita. We'd like to usually use real numbers. But what this allows us to do is it allows us to compare GDP per capita in the US versus Brazil versus GDP per capita in Cuba versus GDP per capita in the UK or whatever country. And then we can compare across countries. Alright, recessions and depressions. A recession is a specifically defined term in economics. It is a downturn in output for 3 quarters or 9 months. A depression has no actual economic definition. Depression is a very large downturn in output and employment, but there's no real exact definition. But what matters here when for economists, when looking at recessions and depressions, we need to account for both the depth of the recession and the length of the downturn. Alright, so if we're going to define that a recession and depression is a downturn in economic growth for 3 quarters, and then we define or we calculate economic growth in terms of gross national product and gross domestic product, well, we need to talk about what we include in gross national product and gross domestic product. Okay, what do we count? What do we count as economic activity? So what's included and what's not? Anything that we can't monetize or anything that we can't put in terms of dollars, we do not include in gross domestic product and gross national product, because these two figures are a dollar figure. So anything we can't monetize does not count. So volunteer work does not count. Unpaid housework does not count. Raising children does not count. Now, if we instead of volunteering at the soup kitchen, if we worked at the soup kitchen for wages, that would count. If we were a butler or a maid and housework was not unpaid, then butlers and maids do count as economic activity. Raising your own children doesn't count doesn't count as an economic activity, but if you take your children to a daycare, that does count as economic activity because that's now monetized. Some monetary activity is not included because we can't count for it, right? Again, gross national product and gross domestic product is the dollar value or the monetary value of all final goods and services produced for an economy within a year. So if it's non-monetary, we can't count it. But if it's monetized but not accounted for, then that's not counted for GDP and GNP. So some monetary activity that's not included is illegal income, because obviously is unreported. A lot of income is unreported, cheating on taxes. Again, if we can't account for it, then we can't include it in gross national product. Environmental depletion is not subtracted out in accounting for gross domestic product and gross national product, or when accounting for economic growth. Environmentalists don't like this. Why? Because think about the United States. If we want to grow more, if we want to increase our gross domestic product, well, we can do that by cutting all the trees down and turning that into lumber and selling the lumber at Menards. That would increase economic activity, but then we would not have any more trees. So environmentalists say, hey, we need to take into account the real costs of growth and subtract out environmental depletion but as of right now, we do not. Gross domestic product and gross national product should not be used as an indicator of well-being. Why? Because it just measures the amount of economic activity taking place in the economy. It says nothing about the distribution of that output. It says nothing about environmental depletion. Bad stuff or cost of life expenditures increase gross domestic product and gross national product. It increases economic activity. So, for example, when there's an oil spill, we need to pay to clean up that oil spill. But that's a service that is being done in our economy, the service of cleaning up the oil, which we count. But it would probably be better if we just didn't spill oil at all. So, what we call cost of life expenditures increase gross domestic product. The point is that gross domestic product and gross national product is a purely quantitative measure. It's not qualitative. So when we talk about economic growth, we need to ask, well, what kind of growth? Should we talk about sustainable growth? Yeah, is the economic growth that we have today, is that full or high employment growth? Right, because sometimes we have what economists call jobless growth, meaning that we have that in the Obama administration from basically 2008, 2009 onward has been jobless growth. Right, the economy has been growing. We have not been in a recession during that period, but we have not had jobs. So we're not in a recession, but it's been jobless growth. All right, so to actually quantify economic activity, we need to talk about aggregate variables. And by aggregate, we mean total. So if we're going to define gross domestic, well, let's just define it here real quick. So if we're going to define gross domestic product is equal to the total money value of final goods and services produced by, or I'm sorry, maybe this should be within a country for a given year. Sorry about my terrible handwriting here. Gross domestic product, total money value of final goods and services produced within a country for a given year. Okay? It's a measure of economic growth. Right? It includes anything that we can monetize. Okay? Doesn't include anything we can't monetize. It's just the dollar amount in the United States. It's the dollar amount of economic activity for a year. So how do we calculate that? Well, we calculate that by adding up aggregate demand. And aggregate demand is the total money amount of all consumers, firms, and government agencies spend on final goods and services in a year. Right? So if GDP looks at the total amount of growth or the total amount of production, but that amount of production needs to be bought by people, right? So we can look at it from either way. We can look at it from the production side of it, or we can look at it from the demand side of it. And it is actually easier to account for economic activity when looking at it from the demand side. right? Because if a firm produces a good, it needs to be bought by either a consumer, another firm, or the government, or another country. So we call this aggregate demand. And we use this to measure gross domestic product. And why do we count final goods and services? We count final goods and services to avoid double counting, right? So Toyota, Chevrolet can't produce a pickup truck for $35,000, and then you buy it, and then you sell it to me for $35,000. Well, we can't count you buying the truck from Chevy for $35,000, and then you selling the truck to me for $35,000, because then we accounted for that truck twice. So we account for only newly produced goods and services, because that avoids double counting the stuff that's produced, right? So, how do we account for this? Well, consumers can buy goods, so we need to look at aggregate consumption. And aggregate consumption is the total spending by consumers on newly produced goods and services in a year. Again, newly produced to avoid double counting. So if I go to Herberger's and I buy towels from Herberger's, that's a newly produced good produced by Herberger's, and I'm purchasing it, and that goes towards aggregate consumption. Aggregate investment is the total spending on, or total spending of firms on capital goods, new plant and equipment in a year. No financial investments, no resales of existing physical assets. So when Chevy produces a truck, if I purchase that truck, that counts as a consumer purchase. However, if KD Floral Company, who runs a floral delivery business, purchases that truck in order to sell flowers, or deliver flowers, then that truck, it's not a consumer good, but it's a capital good, because it is used for the purpose of delivering flowers, which is a commodity. Okay, so in that case, that truck, in the latter example, that truck would be a piece of equipment that is used by a business, the floral company. Okay, it just depends upon who buys the truck. If a consumer buys the truck, then the truck is considered a consumption good. If a business buys the truck for a floral delivery business or pizza delivery business, then that truck is considered a capital good bought by businesses, and that's counted as investment. Just depends upon who's buying it. Education is actually considered a consumption good, because it's bought by consumers, even though it perhaps should be considered an investment, but it's actually classified as a consumption good. So you are currently a consumer, and I'm producing a new service, a lecture on macroeconomic concepts, and you guys are consuming my lecture, which you paid for. It's a consumption good. Okay, not financial investments. Okay, when we think of financial investments like a certificate of deposit, or a money market account, or whatever these financial investments are, in macroeconomics, this is not considered an investment. It's called savings. Okay, to be classified as an investment in macroeconomics, we're talking about the purchase of new plant and equipment by a business. Okay, we're talking about physical plant and equipment. That's what we call investment in economics, or capital goods, investment in economics. Okay, financial investments in economics, we call that savings. So let's not get confused by the two concepts. Okay, government spending is the total value of purchases of goods and services by the government in a year. It does not include transfer payments like Social Security. Transfer payments are when the government transfers money to another sector. So Social Security, government transfers money to people on Social Security. Unemployment benefits, the government transfers money to those who are unemployed. And we don't count that because then when consumers get that income and then they spend on goods and services, then we count that spending as consumption. And again, why? To avoid double counting. So when the government buys new goods and services, or when they build new roads, new schools, things like that, we count that as government expenditure, and we count that as economic growth. But we discount Social Security payments and unemployment benefits. Alright, aggregate exports is the value of goods and services sold to other countries in a year. Aggregate imports is the value of goods and services bought from other countries in a year. So exports are goods leaving the U.S. and money coming into the U.S. Imports are goods being bought from other countries and money going to those other countries. So net exports then is the difference between exports minus imports. So if exports minus imports is greater than 0, or exports is greater than imports, a country has a trade surplus. If exports minus imports is less than 0, or exports is less than imports, a country has a trade deficit. If the two are equal, a country has balanced trade. Pretty simple. Net exports, in other words, exports minus imports for the world as a whole has to be 0, because one country's exports is another country's imports. So when we sum it all up for the entire globe, it has to balance out to 0. It never does, and we call the difference statistical error. So, aggregate national income. Okay, what we talked about before, we also called it Y, but we talked about national output, and national output was the summation of all consumer goods plus all investment goods plus all government spending plus all exports minus all imports. National income is a little differently. National income is wages, interest, rent, profits in a year, no transfer payments, no taxes deducted out. However, if you think about it, national output has to equal national income, because if we say that national income is wages, well, what are wages? Wages is just the income that consumers use to purchase consumption goods. What are profits? Profits is just the income that businesses use to purchase business goods. Okay? What are taxes? Tax is just the income that governments use to purchase government purchases. So national income has to equal national output. They have to. Now we can talk about aggregate disposable income, or sometimes we like to call this after-tax income, which is national income minus taxes plus transfer payments, and that's the income available for spending. We denote this as YD, and this is the Y, which is national income, and then little d just means disposable, which is equal to national income minus aggregate taxes. So it's just gross income minus taxes is disposable income. Aggregate taxes is the total value of all taxes collected in a year, which has to then be equal to the average tax rate times aggregate income. So think about your paychecks, right? For your own personal self, on your paychecks you have your gross income, and then you have your net income. And your gross income is your income before taxes, or we have Y here. And your net income is your disposable income that you can throw away, which is just your gross income minus the taxes that they took out. And how do they figure out how much taxes to take out of your check? Well, you have some tax rate, little t, it's just some percentage, and they multiply that by however much your gross income was, and they figured out how much taxes to take out. They took those taxes out, and you're left over with your disposable income. Well, now just take that concept and multiply that for the economy as a whole, or aggregate that up for the economy as a whole. So we have gross income minus the taxes, all the taxes government collects, and then you get disposable income that consumers and businesses actually use to buy goods and services, and then you get the amount of taxes that governments use to purchase goods and services in any given year. Okay, and then we can kind of do the math here. We can say disposable income is equal to y minus little ty, just substituting in, because this and this. Big T is equal to little t times y, so disposable income is equal to y minus big T. Okay, same thing here. Just an algebraic manipulation there. Further, our disposable income, there's only two things you can do with it. Is equal to consumption plus savings. Okay, there's only two things. We can consume our income or we can save it. Okay, that must equal disposable income. And then just math here, right? S is equal to YD minus C. Or savings is just left over from what our disposable income is minus what we spent on consumption. We have left over as savings. So, national product is equal to national income. Aggregate output has to equal aggregate income, like I said before. Why? Because if a firm sells $100 worth of output, that money is used to pay wages, rent, interest to workers, landlords, banks, and what's left over is profit or loss, which is also income for the firm. So a national income equation, like we alluded to before, it's equal to national output, which is equal to national income, is equal to aggregate consumption plus aggregate investment plus aggregate government spending plus aggregate exports minus aggregate imports. It's an easy equation, but it's useful. Also, we have injections in the economy, which is here on the left-hand side. And then we have withdrawals from the economy, which is here on the right-hand side. These two sides must balance out. Total injections must equal total withdrawals. The two have to equal. Okay? Investment plus government spending plus expenditures must equal savings plus taxes plus imports. Now, that doesn't mean that like exports have to equal imports. Okay, it doesn't mean we need to have balanced trade. It just needs to mean that our injections equal our withdrawals. Just means that this side, total injections in the economy, right? Investment, it's an injection into the economy. Why? Because this is businesses spending money into the economy. Government spending, that's government spending money into the economy. That's injection. Exports, right? That's other countries buying stuff from us. This is an injection of into the economy. Savings. Savings is income not spent. Okay, savings is production that has not been purchased. Okay, if our income's not being spent, we're not going to Starbucks and we're not buying the coffee if we decide to save our money. So savings is a withdrawal from the economy. Taxes is the government taking money away from us, right? Increase in taxes decreases our disposable income, which decreases the amount that we can spend. so it's a withdrawal from the economy. Imports is money leaving our economy, so it's a withdrawal. So these are all withdrawals. They have to equal injections. It's a equality. So we can just play around with the identity here, and we can put S minus I is equal to G minus T plus X minus M. Or in other words, we put the private sector because this side, this is private, if you can read that. This here is the government spending minus taxes, and this here is the foreign sector, exports minus imports. So we just took that equation that we had before, injections, I plus G plus X equals S plus T plus M, and we just moved letters around, but algebraically it's equal. So what do we see here though? We see here that if the private sector is in surplus, or if savings is greater than investment, then that has to be equal to a budget deficit plus a foreign sector surplus. Okay? Or a trade deficit. Okay? Meaning the money has to go somewhere. If the private sector has money left over, the private sector is in surplus, then this side must be in deficit. Has to be. Or we can just move things around. A public sector surplus, meaning all the government stuff over here, has to be equal to the public sector surplus is equal to the trade deficit plus the private sector deficit. Okay? And then finally, gross domestic product and gross national product are measures of aggregate output. They're calculated either by taking a final goods approach and a value added approach. So here's our example here. Let's say that we are making oil, and we're going to drill for the oil. And then so we drill for it, and let's say that oil costs 50 cents. And so the value added, while we had no oil before we drilled for it, the value added is 50 cents. And then we refine the oil, and after it's refined, the value of that oil is 65 cents. Or the value added is 15 cents on top of that 50. Right, just taking that difference here. And then we could ship the oil. When we ship the oil, it sells for 80 cents, or the value added is 15 cents on top of that. And then when finally it sells at the gas station, that gasoline sells for $1, or the value added on top of that is 20 cents. So, right? If a gasoline sells at retail for $1, that must be equal to the summation of all the value added, which we see that it does. And so when we calculate GDP, we can count the value of the value added at every stage, and then sum them all up to get the total value added. So, for example, if we produce the Toyota truck, the Chevrolet truck, we're going to have to count the value added of the steel, of the steering wheel, of the tires, of the seat cushions, of the fabric that goes in the seat cushions, of all these inputs that are used just to make that truck. Or we can just count the value of the truck, the final retail value of the truck. And economists always use the final value of retail sales when calculating GDP because it's a heck of a lot easier. So that is a lecture on macroeconomic concepts. If you have any questions over the lecture, please feel free to email me with any questions you may have. All right, thank you.